Welcome to Stelligent's DevOps on AWS Radio, with your hosts, Paul Duvall and Brian Jakovich.
Welcome to our 23rd episode of DevOps on AWS Radio. I'm Paul Duvall, CTO at Emphasis Stelligent. You can check out our previous episodes by searching on DevOps on AWS Radio and going to Stelligent's blog. We're hiring. We're looking for engineers who are passionate about continuous integration, continuous delivery, DevOps on the AWS platform. We're also looking for project managers. So in general, we're looking for DevOps professionals that have experience on AWS. In this episode, we're going to be discussing recent news in the DevOps on AWS world, along with a discussion with Tom McLaughlin, who is a founder of the consultancy ServerlessOps. So let's get into some DevOps on AWS news. So the AWS Cloud Development Kit has released an experimental version of Python support. So the AWS Cloud Development Kit is a framework for defining cloud infrastructure as code. So you can use a high-level programming language to define your cloud infrastructure. And it supports, out of the box, it's actually written in TypeScript, supports TypeScript, JavaScript, C#, Java, and now, again, experimental, and it's still in beta. Overall, the CDK is in beta, but experimental version of Python. So check that out. We have a post to someone that has just used it, and so they go through kind of the pros and cons of using it. There's a guide to locally testing containers with Amazon ECS using local endpoints and Docker Compose. There's also a security overview of AWS Lambda. It's an in-depth look at Lambda security. A lot of people have questions on serverless security. What's different? What's the same? So it gets into some specifics around that. So there's a white paper AWS just published on that. You can now use AWS config rules. So I've talked about AWS config rules. We've talked about it on the podcast. Also has a screencast and talked about it recently at AWS Loft. But there's a new feature out that allows you to remediate non-compliant resources. And this is a really powerful feature. So for example, if you have certain AWS resources that are non-compliant that you've defined based on your AWS config rules, once it's non-compliant, you can configure it to say stop an instance or terminate an instance with approval, or create a snapshot. There's probably 50 different remediations out of the box that you can incorporate into config rules. So it's just a really great feature. I'm looking forward to trying this out in more detail. There's also an example of a static analysis tool called CFNlint on AWS's blog. So they go over Git pre-commit validation of AWS CloudFormation templates, and basically it looks for best practice adherence to certain best practices. Next thing is a blog on enabling self-service secured data science using Amazon SageMaker notebooks and AWS Service Catalog. So Service Catalog really provides a governance in front of your CloudFormation templates, and so they go over how to use Service Catalog along with SageMaker, which is the machine learning platform from AWS. There's another post on automating account creation and resource provisioning using AWS Service Catalog, along with AWS organizations and AWS Lambda. So it goes over a comprehensive view on having the governance and also the automated creation around that. So the last thing I wanted to talk about actually was on AWS's blog probably a month or so ago, and I had put a comment when I retweeted it. But it's on implementing Git flow using AWS Code Pipeline, AWS Code Commit, Code Build, and Code Deploy. One of the interesting things that they mentioned at the very beginning of this blog post was, quote, "Before we begin, we want to point out that we strongly encourage Amazon teams to practice continuous integration via trunk-based development, where developers regularly merge their code changes into a central repository, ideally several times a day. And when teams are able to regularly merge small changes, they minimize the complexity of the merge and thereby the effort. Combining trunk-based continuous integration with continuous delivery reduces the lead time of getting a change into production, which I think is just a great description of this. And so it's interesting, not all of our customers use trunk-based development, and they're using some kind of branching model. The ideal is if you are using some kind of branching model, which is the reality of a lot of enterprises, a lot of organizations. But if you are doing that you are merging to trunk or master, whatever you call it, your main line, to be generic, at least once a day. What we tend to see is when people go down the branching route, even though they intend to merge to master, it tends that you tend to see these longer and longer branches along the way. And so that's why trunk-based development are really just, that's really the definition of continuous integrations predicated on trunk-based development, but then some of the rest of the practices. The whole point there is that you're getting feedback on a regular basis. So enough of my soapbox. Let's get into the discussion with Tom McLaughlin from ServerlessOps. Yes, we're talking to Tom McLaughlin. So Tom and I met. I think I became introduced to you, Tom, back in early last year, 2018. I came across your blog on ServerlessOps, and then we met at the AWS Summit in New York City, I think sometime that summer. And then you actually gave a talk to Stelligent internally to our all hands meeting that we have every Friday. And so, based on that, I thought it'd be great to have our listeners listen to you and your background. And so why don't you just give a brief introduction and start things off?
Sure. So I'm an operations engineer by background. I've worked in multiple SaaS companies and particularly startups the past several years of my career. I founded ServerlessOps over a year ago. This is an AWS cloud and DevOps consulting company with a specialty in both working with startups and also using serverless technology.
So you work with these different SaaS companies. How did you get interested in serverless? Were you using serverless in some of these other companies, or?
So what happened was I was working on a small project. It was just really to do some integrations between my company's product and all these other products. And I was looking at kind of like, how would I do this? And I kind of just didn't want to be spinning up hosts in EC2 and doing any sort of chef work. So just like, why not? Let's try this. Let's try and actually go the serverless route in order to build this, because these were like perfect use cases. It was take a webhook from the product and then send data, enrich the data and send it to another product. And that's really, that's how I got into it. And there was a kind of a moment where I looked at, what I had just built and what I didn't have to do. And I literally had this like existential dread over the fact that I skipped over all this work that had been for the past, 5, 6, 7 years, maybe closer to 10, all that work that had literally just been my job day to day, every single day. So that sort of struck me. And it really made me realize that, because I didn't really hear anybody talking about, what do operations people do if more and more companies go serverless. So I decided, I'm just going to dive into this topic, and I want to explore this. And through a series of more events, I've eventually founded ServerlessOps.
So we've talked about serverless in a couple of episodes, but for anyone that might be new to it, can you just give a basic, brief introduction of what it is?
Yep. So there's a lot of different definitions that float around that cover a lot of different technologies. What I like are the AWS 4 points that are the 4 characteristics of something that is serverless. And first one, of course, is there's no servers, VMs, or containers to provision or manage. Next, it's a pay-per-use model. So you'll hear people say, well, you never pay for idle, which means if nobody's using your service, you're not paying for it. You're only paying when someone is actively engaged using the service. Next, it scales with usage. So I'm not responsible for provisioning more Lambda instances like I would be responsible for scaling the number of EC2 instances for a service. And then finally, availability and fault tolerance is built in. I'm not worried about, what happens if, my SQS queue goes down. On the back end, AWS has been taking care of that for me. So it's those 4 things are really what describes something that is serverless and something that's not serverless. And what's very interesting is a lot of people have been using serverless. They've been building serverless applications, just single page apps using S3, hosted out of S3 and maybe CloudFront in front of it. That's a serverless app, and that might be something that you've been doing for ages. That's a pretty common S3 use case.
So you mentioned you have an operations background that kind of led you into serverless and being interested in that. What types of use cases are good from an operations standpoint when it comes to serverless?
I think what you really should be doing as an operations person is, if you have a platform, you've potentially bought a bunch of products and using them in your environment. So you have a security platform, you have a CI/CD platform, you have a metrics and analytics platform. Well, so many of those services, they have a webhook. When something happens in those services, they will fire a request to an endpoint. And that's where you should be thinking to yourself, okay, when I use this service, here are all these things I do manually, but what if when an event happened, I could automate those tasks away? Again, as an ops person, I think that's the first place you should be looking is, here are all these manual tasks I do. My product will literally tell me when it's done something and what it's done. Let me ingest that and then automate my work away. And it's very easy to get started that way. Some other things, compliance checks, you're checking the state of, whether it's maybe like for security or something like that, and then alerting you and letting you know when something is, needs to be remediated. Another one I have is what I like to call information direction, where something happens and I just want to send a message to Slack or HipChat, or I want to fire an alarm to PagerDuty, VictorOps, or OpsGenie or something like that. Those are the sort of things in the ops world that, I immediately look for to go serverless.
So, Tom, you just talked about compliance checks and also remediation, and this is something that we've been talking about a lot recently. I've given a talk on using AWS config rules and Lambda to perform remediation. And, what are you finding some interesting ways of doing this that you may have seen, or at least ideas that you have around a remediation when it comes to compliance?
Sure. So one interesting case I've seen is, and it's not auto remediation within their environment, but it's a company that has very open, they grant developers and other engineers open access to AWS, and you go ahead, you spin something up. Well, if you spin something up that's out of spec, an alert gets fired. That event hits a service that then shoots a message to you in Slack and says, hey, did you do this? And okay, you can either say yes, and maybe it gives you some some warning of like, hey, please change this or something like that, or you have to put your VM in jail or something like that. But what's more interesting is if you don't respond to that Slack message, that event eventually gets escalated up to their SOC, and now somebody in their security operations center is going to give you a call, and they're going to ask, hey, did you do this? It's not because now that they're concerned about, a security group that's too open. They're concerned on whether or not someone actually did this, knowingly, or whether maybe somebody's account credentials were compromised. And so they want to hear from you and say, yes, I did this. Okay, I understand. I'll remediate this. Or they want to hear, oh, what are you talking about? And so they can say, yeah, we need to treat this incident completely different than the average incident. So while you can do a ton of automation with serverless, it also still a lot of things that still need that human element in order to properly resolve.
Mm-hmm. So that's a clever use of using both automation and then the human element as well. It actually makes me think of like using step functions or some kind of workflow. And a process like that could be interesting. So when it comes to enterprises, where do you see serverless being adopted? Where are we on the adoption curve?
The adoption curve, I think, is very interesting. When I went into this over a year ago, and even getting into the space almost 2 years ago, I thought we were going to have, the rocket ship curve of just kind of like, it's going to immediately take off. I thought it would very heavily mirror the adoption of Docker and Kubernetes. And what I'm instead seeing is, I don't want to say slower adoption, but it is definitely growing at a different rate. And I think instead of just being that quick rocket ship up, it's going to be more of that hockey stick curve. And I think something that's important to remember is if I did this a few weeks ago, I did the Google trend graph for VMware versus AWS. And going back to 2004, like you see VMware just take off and then it plateaus for a while. And then you see AWS has this very long hockey stick where, within the past few years, surpassed VMware. But you can see that growth of serverless is going to go that way. Serverless, to me, is going to be the long-term winner. It's not going to be the short-term winner. I don't think you're going to see a ton of heavy serverless first adoption. So say like the Nordstroms of the world, where they just, said, okay, everything that we build, we're going to build it serverlessly if possible. And only if we can't are we going to go resort back to containers or VMs.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think the serverless adoption is maybe slower, and then at some point it's going to pick up?
I think because the ability to take a service and jam it in a container is so easy. You don't have to change. A lot of times we were still talking about people graduating from the monolith idea to the microservices idea. It's a much bigger jump, I think, for a lot of people to go from microservices to, event-driven services, or to go to these much smaller nano services. And so it's going to take time. It's going to take time for people to develop the patterns, develop the correct understanding. And when given the option for two different pathways, a lot of people are going to choose the quicker path, even if that means they have to, invest a ton of manpower into Kubernetes and getting that up and going. So I think that's what's really happening right now. What you're going to see is a lot of hybrid adoption. You're going to see, again, this slow hockey stick within a lot of organizations where it just kind of creeps in, and slowly it just starts eating away at the traditional way of building apps. Again, it's going to take a little bit of time. There's a lot for people to learn and a lot for people to adjust to. When you talk about development techniques and development tools and development processes, people are very hard to change. Things are muscle memory for them. When you ask them to change, that can be a little tough.
When you say hybrid adoption, if you can clarify that, I think a lot of people will think hybrid adoption, we got stuff in the data center, we have stuff on the cloud. You're referring to something else when you say that, right?
Yeah, I'm referring to, you're going to have workloads in containers, maybe on EC2, but you're going to start with a small but growing amount of workloads that are going to run on Lambda and so forth. So that's where I mean hybrid adoption. I was actually thinking earlier today that I refer to on-prem as actually people's own cloud environments. So yeah, that idea of what is hybrid is definitely going to change over time.
Now, when did you start using the cloud or AWS?
Let's see. I think full time was 2013, and then maybe just a little bit here and there between 2010 and 2013.
Yeah, I was curious what your take on where we are. In many ways, I see serverless as like cloud 2.0, right? And so I see a lot of parallels between the cloud adoption, especially in the enterprise, and then where we are with serverless now. And I guess in my mind, I'm thinking we're about 2012 or so when it comes to the cloud adoption, how enterprises were looking at the cloud at that point. We got involved in it in 2009 with enterprises, but at the same time, these were unicorns for many, many years. So I'm thinking we're somewhere around there, but I'm curious your take since you go back about that far as well.
I'm putting it around, and this was based on the Google trend graphs that I did. I'm putting us around maybe 2010 for what AWS adoption looked like.
Okay. Right. When it comes to serverless, yeah.
Yeah, where you had think of AWS adoption in 2010, where it's picking up. You're having companies make the bigger bets, but there's still a little more to go. VMware in the data center was running pretty strong in 2010, which Kubernetes is doing right now as well.
Right. Yeah. One of the things we talk about with our enterprise customers is by being essentially a late adopter, if you will, which in reality there's tons of workloads and applications that aren't running on AWS. A lot of times you'll hear that, 90% of enterprises are using the cloud or whatever. But in reality, when you look at the actual applications and workloads, it's much, much less than that. And so we're still early on in the adoption. But that said, you can actually, by being a late adopter to the cloud, you can skip some of what's becoming legacy, really. You start thinking about EC2 and in some cases containers by jumping right into whether it's containers or whether it's serverless. And so you can jump ahead of the competition in some ways by being a late adopter. So.
Yeah, we're talking a little bit about the leapfroggers. iRobot was a leapfrogger, Amtrak was a leapfrogger. They skipped over EC2, skipped over containers, and they went from the on-prem data center to serverless. And that requires a certain type of organization, I think, in my mind. It requires an organization that really believes learning and experimenting is just a part of their company culture, because there's going to be some stops and starts. There's going to be a lot of hurdles to leap. But if you feel that learning is important to your company and you allow for it, you plan for it, et cetera, then I think being a leapfrogger is definitely very possible. But again, it takes a certain sort of organization to be able to do that. An organization that thinks that they're just going to go serverless and it's going to be 100% roses, that's not going to work. That doesn't work if you're going just from your monolith in the data center to EC2. It just happens that it's, the monolith in the data center to EC2 is a little bit more forgiving than going from the monolith.
Very familiar paradigm.
Right.
Right. And it's the same with containers. It's a very familiar paradigm. You have to change everything when it comes to serverless.
And yeah, you're going to have to, I've looked at apps where it's Java web services communicating among each other. And I'm looking at the diagram for it and I'm like, this should just be some asynchronous processing pipeline, and you shouldn't be, routing requests over API gateway. You should just be using SNS and stringing functions along. So that was a learning point for that client right there.
Now, so you do a lot of work with startups, right? What would you say the differences are with the startups and their ability to adopt serverless? So
I'm a very big fan that as a startup, your technology shouldn't get in the way, okay? Your organization needs to survive. If you're in a startup and you've accumulated technical debt, congratulations, you've lived long enough in order to accumulate that debt and for these earlier decisions to become a problem. So right now, when I deal with startups, the way I talk to them is I look for a lot of startups that are very early. So they're maybe pre-seed A, post-seed A, and they don't have a lot of cloud experience within the company. What they have is a product developer who knows a little bit of AWS, and that's their part-time job. But they're not an expert in it, and they don't spend full time on all this stuff. And so where I've been talking to people is, you know what? You just need someone that's there to hold your hand and take care of a certain amount of things for you. And you don't need me full time at all. How serverless fits into that is I tell people, if you're already using containers, we're going to use ECS. But anything new I build, that's going to run on Lambda. So for those sort of companies that I work with, it's actually me bringing in serverless to them, because I'm dealing with CTOs or VPs of engineering who aren't necessarily at the point where they're really caring about how it's getting done. They're caring that they're hitting their business metrics and KPIs, so that they can satisfy a board meeting with their VCs, so that they can then do their next round of funding. So that's how the story changes a bit when you're dealing with startups.
Got it. So, we talk a lot about on this podcast on DevOps practices and continuous delivery. And so from a setting up deployment pipelines, things like that for serverless applications or serverless web applications, what types of considerations does someone need to make when it comes to deployment pipelines for serverless? And what's the same? What's different?
So what I noticed when I started first building a Travis pipeline was artifact management. That was actually something that I found a little bit lacking in my current setup and tools. And so I had Serverless Framework, and Serverless Framework pulls down its plugins and all its plugin dependencies. It pulls down my application's dependencies, but there wasn't a very good built-in way for me to say, okay, now package this and stick it here. And that is my artifact that I want to use throughout the pipeline. So what I ended up having to do was, was to essentially script zipping up my directory, putting it in S3, next stage of the pipeline, pulling it down from S3, unzipping it, CDing into that directory. So I really wish there was more, maybe a better story around that sort of artifact management, and to ensure that what I built and tested all the way in build stage 1 is exactly what's going out the door once you get to the end of this processing pipeline in prod.
Mm-hmm. So an artifact management type of system for...
Absolutely. Whether it's an artifact management system, whether it's just even better tooling in order to just deploy that to manage that artifact, that's really what I would like right now.
So you're still building it, you're still running tests on it, you're probably running some linting, static analysis, security checks, you're deploying it. It's a little bit different in serverless, but you're still going through the same basic steps that you would in a container-based or a EC2-based application.
Absolutely. And if you've done, if you're building artifacts that go out to EC2, or artifacts that go on a container, or container is actually an artifact, you know how important it is to you to ensure that you're using that one single artifact through the entire pipeline.
So we've gotten this question a lot when it comes to DevOps, and people having the concern, that their job's going to be different or even go away in some cases. That sometimes gets expressed in some way or another. And so when people start thinking about serverless, they're like, well, there's no servers to manage anymore. So how does the operations function? How does that change when it comes to serverless apps?
So let me preface it with this. There's two ways of looking at this. There's the way of, you have serverless slowly creeping the org, and then it's very different if you talk about an organization that went completely serverless first. If you're an operations person, you start seeing serverless slowly creeping into the org. Okay, the things that you're going to want to start looking at are you hitting AWS limits? You want to make sure that your events are being reliably passed from one function to another. But you can see there's still operational work that needs to be done. But instead of focusing on the underlying platform, like the hosts and the container management platform, you need to really move up the stack into how is my application performing? And so not everybody as an operations person might be used to that, saying, hey, is this application performing correctly? They might be more in an organization where actually they handed that over to developers. So that's something, as an ops person, you need to really start thinking about. I need to go up the stack, and I need to, understand a little bit more about the running code. When you go to a serverless first organization, that's when it really hits you. And you have to start asking yourself, well, okay, if there's no servers for me to manage, what do I do? And this is where I'm a big fan of, I've wanted operations people to leave operations teams and actually join what are many organizations I've been in. They're called product pods or feature teams. And so you have a PM, you have a designer, you have, say front-end developer, back-end developer. I've wanted to see operations people move into these teams, or maybe be shared among teams. But yeah, if there's no host for you to manage anymore, you should now be working more directly with these teams about, okay, how do we ensure that you write reliable application code and build reliable systems? So this is where I think you're going to start seeing a bit of, like I had, that existential dread of what do I do each day? So
the operations fine. I mean, there's still monitoring going on. There's still security. There's still security and compliance. It might get spread over teams. Is that what you're suggesting? I mean, because regardless, I would imagine at a high level, you still have an SRE type of I'm thinking enterprise, but against all these different functions, especially as you imagine, if it grows as large as it could within an enterprise, you would have to be looking across all those functions. So there would be so that would still exist, but you're also saying like on the individual teams is having maybe a person that has that capability. Would they be spread across teams, or you want them embedded at 100% on those teams?
I just want to ensure that, it's like, yes, either have them embedded, have them own multiple teams, but I don't want to see operations remain its own team silo. I think the greater mass of operations people that you collect together on a single team, the more they look for operations tasks to do, and there's going to be less and less of those. And my fear actually is then they're going to be off in a corner while you have all these dev teams that are they're just going to completely bypass them and their expertise, and they're going to ship things that don't necessarily make sense or are hard to keep, reliable in production and so forth. So that's where I'm thinking about this. Like, again, I'm worried about operations people still siloing themselves and then being bypassed, and then, are they seen as valuable anymore? So that's why I like having them more directly either embedded or definitely owning relationships. Like, I'm a consultant. You're a consultant. I could see a way of forming your operations people where, no, they're consultants and they own the customer relationship internally with certain dev teams, and it's their job to keep that, that internal customer relationship alive and functioning properly. There's no limit to the amount of different ways that you could probably rethink your operations organization. Just make sure that you don't end up with an operations team that is internally focused on itself.
Right. And that's the theme I'm hearing as well, is the operations function becomes closer to the end user.
Yes.
Regardless of how you organize it, that should be the objective, closer to the customer.
That brings up another great point. I got to say this, we've heard the term shift left for like all these years. And there's this, I think it's a mistake to believe that the shift left ends at development. I think your developers should be shifting further left to product.
Right.
And they should be better understanding what the PM's doing and how they're interacting with customers. So, when people talk about this shift left, they say, well, we'll just have developers do all this stuff. Well, okay, but maybe you should be filling your developers' time with better understanding the problem domain and the business domain that they're actually working on, instead of saying, okay, developer, now you write some YAML to deploy this.
So kind of continuing down this operation, we talked about you talked about product pods and the team and the org structure. We hinted on this when we were talking about the operations function. What about security? Does security change in any way when you go to serverless?
It stays the same but looks different. I guess that's the way I kind of think about it. I think PureSec, who you had on a few episodes ago, was pretty good. They took the OWASP top 10. I got introduced to that like 2-3 years ago. I thought that was a great way. The OWASP top 10 lists, the top 10 ways that, web applications are breached. They translated that list into a serverless top 10. So, and if you read both of them closely, you realize that it's a lot of the same things, just different. It's like you have to sanitize your inputs. Okay, you have to actually maintain your application dependencies and worry about those. So again, it looks different, but to me, it's still at the heart very much the same. As a security person, as an operations person, you're gonna find yourself moving up the stack. You're not dealing with host OS patches and who SSH'd into what. You're worrying about application dependencies and is somebody somehow injecting events that are causing untold or unexpected ways for your application to behave.
All right, so let's get into a little bit of an esoteric topic. I've been reading about a few people out there talking about FinDev and Simon Wardley being one of them, but a few others as well. And I know AWS has actually written about this when it comes to serverless. Maybe you can talk about what is FinDev from your perspective. I'm sure it's a nascent topic, so people have different definitions of it right now. But what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. First off, I just want to point out that I'm convinced Simon Wardley only owns one shirt. It is a whitish shirt with brown graph paper look. I have just discovered this over the past week.
Okay. I think he has 12 of the same, perhaps.
I think you were telling me earlier that he's actually written about this. I did not realize it. But so FinDev is first treating cost as a first-class metric. So you're in a pay-per-use model. So you should be in a pay-per-use model. Again, your cost is trailing your actual application usage. So how much you're spending is gonna spike up and down a little bit potentially. It's gonna essentially mirror what how people actually use your application. So that's the first thing to me. But the second thing, which is even way more interesting to me, is can we get to a point where we can actually track revenue generated. So not just, the cost of running my application, but hey, we put this into production and, customer interaction enters here. How much revenue is generated out the back end into the money machine? That's really interesting. And I think it's going to take some time for that for several reasons. First, on the cost thing, I think we're several years out, because if you took an application that was costing you $90 a month in production, and now it costs you $2 a month, do you really care about optimizing pennies? And is that really a good use of your highly expensive developer or operations person's time? But once we finally get to a point where more and more people are going serverless, we're going to kind of forget how much it used to cost to run applications, and we're now going to start haggling over those sort of pennies. The next thing is, how do you track revenue? And that's something I don't know yet, but it is going to be, bring finance more closely into the engineering story or into the IT story, so that we can understand that, hey, here's an application, it costs X, but it generates Y, and that's really good. Like, maybe we actually don't need to spend that much time, optimizing that cost for this one. But yeah, it's still, I think FinDev is still a little ways out, but it is an amazingly fascinating topic. But again, it's still, we still have a ways to go. We still need more serverless adoption, I think, for FinDev to really take off. But if you're someone that's interested in where we're going to be a decade from now, start taking a look at it. And honestly, there's a handful of people in the serverless world who are already talking about this, and they're talking and formulating the ideas that definitely we're going to be listening to and implementing 10 years from now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it further reinforces the concept that IT cannot, is basically, it can no longer be a cost center when you start thinking in these terms of FinDev.
Absolutely. Like, everybody today is a technology company. You need IT in order to make money.
Right. So Tom, thanks a lot for this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
How can people learn more about you? I know you have a number of publications out there. You blog quite frequently. Why don't you share some of those?
Yeah, so on the ServerlessOps website, serverlessops.io, I have an ebook. And when you hear I have an ebook, you're thinking to yourself, oh, great, this person wants my contact info? No, literally just go click on it and download it and read it. And it's intense. It's like 80 pages long. It's exploring what is serverless DevOps going to look like, and what is the future of the operations role going to be. So I would say just go click on it, download it, read it. I also have a newsletter. It's called Cold Start. Subscribe to that. On Twitter, you can find me there. You can find me, or you can find the Serverless Op handle. We'll put those in the show notes. And if you want to see me coming up, Serverless Days / DevOps Days / Map Camp Atlanta. I think that's it's April 9th and 10th. I'm going to be speaking on the first day on the 9th. So come on, say hi and everything like that.
For the latest DevOps best practices on AWS, follow our blog at www.stelligent.com/blog.